The wind howled like a hungry wolf over the grey hill, lashing the cold stones of the abandoned Gothic chapel. Its stained glass windows, once vibrant, were now mere dark holes, nests for birds and echoes of a forgotten past. There, amidst the decaying grandeur, Master Barnaby, a widower with trembling hands and a steadfast heart, tried to light an improvised fire. His two orphaned grandsons, Finn and Liam, too young for the burden they carried, helped stack dry branches, their pale faces marked by cold and hunger. They had been expelled from the village, banished by the cruel lord to that cursed place, and the scorn of their former neighbours was almost as cutting as the icy wind. But Barnaby had promised his late wife he would care for the family, and neither the harsh winter, nor the leaking roof, nor the town's mockery would make them give up. As they cleared thick moss from an ancient confessional, hoping to find a corner less exposed to the elements, a forgotten legend would begin to unfold, promising more than just shelter. The confessional's wood was dark, almost black, and exuded an ancient scent of incense and guarded secrets. Finn and Liam, with their small gloved hands, scrubbed the stubborn moss, revealing intricate carvings of saints and angels, now disfigured by time. Barnaby watched them, his heart aching at the sight of innocence amidst such desolation. That cubicle, once a sanctuary of confessions and absolutions, seemed to be the only refuge against the biting wind that whistled through the ruins. "Here, my little ones," Barnaby said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Perhaps we can shelter a little more from the elements. It's the most enclosed place we have." He pushed open the penitent's latticed door, which groaned in a prolonged lament, and stepped inside. The space was claustrophobic, yet strangely comforting, like an embrace from a distant past. The air inside was less cold, and the darkness seemed to offer a mantle of peace. Barnaby sat on the wooden bench, feeling the weight of years and losses. His grandsons, exhausted, huddled near the entrance, watching him with curious eyes. He closed his eyes, his hands clasped in silent prayer. He did not ask for wealth or comfort, only for strength to protect those two small beings who were all he had left. As the unspoken words echoed in his mind, a subtle hum began to vibrate in the wood beneath his hands. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like the murmur of a distant swarm of bees or the wind passing through a crack. But Barnaby knew it was not the wind. The sound seemed to come from within the wood itself, a strange resonance that made him open his eyes. He tilted his head, trying to discern the origin. The hum intensified, transforming into something more complex. It was not a natural sound of the chapel. It sounded like voices, indistinct whispers, as if someone was speaking far away but directly into his ear. Barnaby frowned, thinking that exhaustion and hunger were finally playing tricks on him. He pressed his ear to the wooden wall, and what was once a murmur now became a chorus of voices, still confused but undeniably human. The sound was clear, yet distant, as if listening through a tunnel. He recognized the cadence of a conversation, the inflection of orders and responses. And then one voice stood out, deep and imperious, with a tone Barnaby had heard only once in his life, during the monarch's coronation. Broadcast by heralds in the village square, it was the king's voice. A cold shiver ran down Barnaby's spine, more intense than any cold the chapel could offer. The king? How? The castle was days away, miles of mountains and forests. It was impossible. His eyes widened in the dark of the confessional. He was not dreaming. The voices were real, and the wood seemed to vibrate with the energy of every word. "As the plan must be executed before the new moon," the royal voice said, clear as if the king were sitting beside him. "No error can be tolerated. The Duke of Valois is an obstacle. His loyalty is questionable and his influence dangerous." Barnaby held his breath. Duke of Valois? An obstacle? He heard another voice, softer, but equally calculating. Your Majesty is right. He has many supporters among the merchants. If he is not contained, he could incite a rebellion. Contained? The king retorted, a tone of impatience in his voice. He must be removed. Discreetly, of course. An accident, a sudden illness. No one must suspect our hand. Barnaby's heart beat like a war drum in his chest. Assassination. The king was plotting an assassination. It was not a legend, not a delusion. That confessional, that piece of ancient wood, was a magical amplifier, a window into the kingdom's darkest secrets. He could hear the monarch's plans miles away, as if he were in the throne room, hidden behind a curtain. The voices continued, detailing logistics, names, locations. Barnaby, a simple man who barely knew how to read, was now privy to a royal conspiracy, a plot of death and power that could shake the foundations of the kingdom. The air inside the confessional seemed to thin. He felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the weight of the information. His grandsons, oblivious to the horror unfolding inches from them, dozed, their faces pale and serene. Barnaby recoiled from the wood, his body trembling. What would he do with this? A poor widower, banished to an abandoned chapel, now holding a secret worth a duke's life, and probably his own, if discovered. The promise to his wife to protect the family gained a new and terrible meaning. How could he protect Finn and Liam from something so vast and dangerous? The shelter he hoped to find in that confessional had turned into a prison of knowledge, a burden that crushed him. He was trapped between loyalty to a tyrannical king and the life of an innocent man, and the only thing he knew for sure was that the world would never be the same. The wind outside howled, but the true terror was now within him. A heavy silence descended upon Master Barnaby, denser and more suffocating than the darkness of the confessional. The voices of the king and his advisor, though now ceased, still echoed in his mind, each word a hammer striking the fragile structure of his peace. Assassination. The Duke of Valois. An accident. The reality was a punch to the stomach, stealing his breath. His fingers, once steady in manual labor, trembled uncontrollably, and a cold sweat ran down his forehead, despite the biting cold that still seeped through the chapel's cracks. He recoiled further from the dark wood, as if it could burn him. What was this? A curse? A blessing disguised as torment? A simple man, a banished widower, now privy to a secret that could bring down a kingdom or cost him his own life and that of his grandsons. The promise made to his late wife to protect Finn and Liam now seemed an impossible task, an overwhelming burden under the weight of a royal conspiracy. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom, sought out the small, sleeping figures near the confessional's entrance. Finn and Liam, so innocent, so oblivious to the abyss that had opened beneath their grandfather's feet. How could he protect them from something as vast and dangerous as a king's wrath? That knowledge was a double-edged sword, and Barnaby felt trapped by its blade. The hum in the wood had diminished, but the feeling that the voices could return at any moment kept him on alert. It was as if the confessional had become a portal, a crack in time and space, allowing him to peek into the darkest secrets of power. He, who barely knew how to read, was now aware of plots that the kingdom's wisest advisors would never dream of unraveling. Barnaby's mind reeled. What to do? Ignore it. Pretend he had heard nothing. That exhaustion and hunger had played a cruel trick on him, but the voices were clear, the words etched in his memory. Before the new moon. The urgency of the phrase resonated. How many days until the new moon? He didn't know for sure, but he felt that time was running out. If he remained silent, the Duke of Valois would die. A man Barnaby barely knew, but who, according to the voices, had many supporters among the merchants. His death could destabilize the kingdom, perhaps even lead to civil war. And if that happened, how would Finn and Liam survive? Life was already precarious in the abandoned chapel. A kingdom in chaos would be the end. But what if he tried to warn someone? Who would believe a banished widower, a madman who claimed to hear the king's plans through a magical confessional? He would be ridiculed, perhaps imprisoned, accused of treason. And the punishment for treason was death. Not only for the traitor, but for his entire family. The image of his grandsons being taken away, perhaps hanged, squeezed his heart with a searing pain. No, that was not an option. Barnaby leaned back against the confessional wall, not to listen, but to feel the cold wood against his back, trying to anchor himself in reality. The wood seemed to vibrate with a residual energy, a silent echo of the words it had transmitted. He closed his eyes, trying to organize his thoughts, but fear was a thick veil obscuring his reason. He was a man of faith, accustomed to seeking solace in prayer. But now, even the sanctuary of a confessional had transformed into a source of terror. That piece of wood, which he hoped would only offer shelter, had given him a burden that weighed more than all the losses he had already endured. Slowly, with the caution of one approaching a sleeping beast, Barnaby tilted his head and pressed his ear to the wood again. The hum was there, faint but present. He waited, his heart pounding. For a long minute, only the howl of the wind and the rustle of dry leaves outside filled the silence. Then, like a thin thread of silk, a new voice emerged, more distant than the previous ones, but with an chilling clarity. Preparations for the Duke's journey to Dragon's Gate are almost complete. He will depart in 3 days. Barnaby held his breath. 3 days. The new moon was near, and the Duke of Valois would be assassinated on his journey. The information was precise, a crucial detail that transformed the conspiracy from a vague threat into an imminent plan. There was no more time to hesitate, to ponder the impossibility. The Duke's life was at stake, and, by extension, the safety of his grandsons. He recoiled again, this time with a cold determination beginning to form amidst his fear. He could not ignore it. He could not risk Finn and Liam's lives for an ill-considered action. But neither could he simply let a man die, knowing he had the power to prevent it. That knowledge, however dangerous, was now his, and with it came a responsibility. Barnaby looked at his grandsons, sleeping soundly, the promise to his wife, protect the family. This meant more than just keeping them warm and fed. It meant navigating this sea of secrets and dangers, finding a path where their innocence could be preserved. The confessional was no longer just a shelter. It was the epicenter of his new and terrible mission. The world, for Master Barnaby, would never be the same, and the peace of his simple life had been shattered by the voice of a king. He needed to think, and fast. The cold of the chapel was an icy embrace, but sweat ran down Barnaby's forehead. 3 days, those 2 words, whispered by a distant voice through the wood, had embedded themselves in his mind like rusty nails. 3 days until the Duke of Valois' departure, 3 days until the accident, 3 days until the kingdom could be plunged into a chaos that he, a banished widower, now had the terrible privilege of foreseeing. His eyes fixed on his sleeping grandsons, Finn and Liam, their small bodies huddled against the cold, exuding the innocence he had sworn to protect. The promise to his wife, made on her deathbed, echoed in his ears. But now it carried an unbearable weight. Protect the family. How? How does one protect a family from a murderous king, from a conspiracy that stretches for miles and hides in the shadows of power? Barnaby's mind was a whirlwind. He was not a man of great deeds, nor of great knowledge. His life had been shaped by hard work, simple faith, and the daily struggle to survive. But now, he was the guardian of a secret that could change the fate of a kingdom. The confessional, which was once a refuge, had transformed into a silent torture chamber, amplifying not only the king's voices, but also the echo of his own helplessness. He tried to rationalize. It was a delusion, yes, it had to be. The exhaustion, the hunger, the grief. But the voices were so real, so clear. The king's cadence, his advisor's coldness, the details of the plot. Dragon's Gate. 3 days. There was no denying it. The confessional's wood was, in fact, a magical amplifier, and he was the unwanted listener. What to do? The question hammered in his head. If he remained silent, the Duke of Valois would die, and the death of an influential duke, with many supporters among the merchants, as the king had said, could incite a rebellion, a civil war. Barnaby had seen the horrors of war in his youth. The burned villages, the hunger, the hopelessness. If the kingdom fell into chaos, Finn and Liam would have no chance. The abandoned chapel, however cold, would not be enough shelter against the fury of a burning kingdom. But what if he acted? Who could he warn? A poor, banished widower who claimed to hear the king's plans through a magical confessional. He would be considered mad, a traitor. The punishment for treason was the gallows, and not just for him, but for his entire lineage. The image of Finn and Liam being dragged away, their faces terrified, was a nightmare more vivid than any reality. No, he could not risk their lives. He was trapped. An iron dilemma. Inaction would lead to the death of a man and the potential chaos of the kingdom, threatening his grandsons. Action would lead to his own death and almost certainly the death of his grandsons. The air seemed to thin, and Barnaby felt the weight of the world on his aged shoulders. Slowly, he crept closer to his grandsons, wrapping his thin body around them, as if he could protect them from the world outside, and from the world of secrets that now inhabited within him. The faint warmth of their childlike bodies was the only comfort, the only anchor in his distorted reality. 3 days, he whispered to himself, his voice hoarse. Time was a relentless enemy. He needed a plan, but his mind was blank, paralyzed by fear. Like a cornered rat, he sought an exit, a tunnel, a crack, anything that would not lead to death or destruction. He could not go to the castle. He could not speak to anyone in power. No one would believe him, but he also could not stand still. The king's voice, cold and calculating, still echoed in his ears. The Duke of Valois' life was a candle about to go out, and Barnaby was the only person who knew. An idea, small and fragile as a dry leaf, began to form in his mind. Not a plan to stop the king, but perhaps a plan to warn the Duke. But how? He barely knew how to leave the chapel without getting lost. How would he reach the Duke of Valois, a powerful noble, before it was too late? He looked at the dark wood of the confessional, now no longer an object of terror, but an object of fascination, of power. If the wood could transmit voices, perhaps it could do more. It was a foolish, desperate idea, born of desperation. But it was the only idea he had. Barnaby closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He was a man of faith, and perhaps, just perhaps, divine providence had placed him there, in that magical confessional, for a reason, not to condemn him, but to give him a chance to protect his family, even if it meant defying a king and risking everything. The peace of his simple life had been shattered. The world would never be the same. And Master Barnaby, the widower, the banished, the guardian of a royal secret, knew he had to act. Not for glory, not for power, but for the promise made to his wife and for the lives of his grandsons. He needed to find a way. And fast. With determination hardening my spine, I leaned back into the confessional. The wood, cold and ancient, seemed to pulse under my touch. I didn't know how, but if it could bring voices from so far away, perhaps it could carry mine. It was an insane thought, a gamble against logic and reason, but desperation was a cruel master. I had to try. I had to communicate, not with the king, but with the victim. What would I say? How would I warn him without exposing myself? The words needed to be precise, urgent, yet enigmatic enough not to incriminate me. I pressed my mouth to the wood, smelling dust and centuries. I took a deep breath, gathering all the courage I had left. The silence of the chapel was almost oppressive, broken only by the faint rustle of the wind outside and the frantic beat of my own heart. I didn't know if the magic would work in reverse, if the wood would be a channel for my voice, or just a tomb for my fears. But I had to try. For Finn, for Liam, for the promise. Duke of Valois, I whispered, the words almost choked in my throat. Do not travel to Dragon's Gate, not in 3 days. Danger, the king. My voice failed. I couldn't say more, I couldn't expose myself, but would it be enough? Would the message be clear enough for a powerful and busy man? I pulled back, exhausted, feeling the energy drain from me. The confessional remained silent, impassive. I didn't know if the message had arrived, if the wood had fulfilled my desperate wish. The only thing I knew was that time was running out, and I had just cast the dice of my life and my grandson's lives in a game I barely understood. The silence of the confessional swallowed my words, leaving me with a chilling emptiness in my chest. I had whispered a warning, a desperate prayer, hoping that the wood's magic would work in reverse. But what? Was the silence proof that I had failed? Or proof that the message had departed, and now I was alone, at the mercy of fate? Exhaustion hit me like a wave, draining the little energy I had left. My body trembled, not only from the chapel's cold, but from the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I moved away from the confessional, feeling older than my years, more fragile than I ever imagined. My grandson slept soundly, oblivious to the weight of the world I carried. Their small, angelic faces were a constant reminder of my promise, my reason for risking everything. But what had I done? I had exposed myself, perhaps, to an even greater danger, without any guarantee of success. The night dragged on, interminable. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the old chapel wood seemed like an omen. I tried to sleep, but my mind was in a whirlwind. The king's voices echoed in my memory, cold and calculating. 3 days! Those words were a hammer beating on my conscience. Now only 2 remained. Time was a relentless enemy, and I had played my only card, a blind card, in the dark. At dawn, the faint light filtering through the chapel's dusty windows brought no solace. Uncertainty was a torture. I needed to know. I needed any sign, any indication that my words had not just been a desperate echo in an empty chamber. With my heart beating like a war drum, I dragged myself back to the confessional. The dark wood seemed to mock my hope. I pressed my ear again, my breath caught in my throat. Silence. A silence that seemed to stretch for miles through the castle walls, the city streets, until it reached that small, abandoned refuge. I expected to hear the king, perhaps, furious at the duke's disobedience, or the advisor discussing alternative plans. But nothing, just emptiness. I began to doubt everything. Had it been a delusion, after all? Hunger, fatigue, grief, all mixing to create an elaborate fantasy. But the voices, they were so real, the plot so detailed. No, I could not deny what I had heard. I stayed there, motionless for hours, my ear glued to the wood like a sentinel at an outpost. My muscles ached, my body protested, but the need to know was stronger than any physical pain. And then, as hopelessness began to set in, a sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A voice. Not the king's, but of a man I did not recognize, with a tone of urgency. "His Majesty is furious," the voice whispered, almost inaudible, but the wood amplified it. "The Duke of Valois postponed his departure. A sudden illness, they say. Or perhaps a premonition." My heart leapt. A premonition. My message. It had arrived. The relief was so overwhelming it almost made me faint. It was not an illness. It was my warning. The Duke had listened, somehow. He had postponed the journey to Dragon's Gate, but the relief was quickly replaced by an even greater terror. His Majesty is furious. The King, furious. This meant that he not only noticed the change in the Duke's plans, but also might be suspicious of something. The unknown man's voice continued, lower now. There was a strange rumor in the corridors, an enigmatic message, whispered by an invisible messenger, they say, something about danger and the King. I froze. My words, my desperate attempt to warn the Duke had turned into a rumor in the castle, and the King was aware of it. I had become a ghost, a whisper, but a dangerous whisper. Suddenly the King's voice, louder, clearer, laden with a contained fury that made me shrink. Find the source of this rumor. No one defies my will with impunity. No one postpones their plans without my permission. If the Duke of Valois thinks he can deceive me with a false illness, he will learn the true meaning of infirmity. The sound of something being thrown, a distant crash. The King was furious, and now he was searching for the source of the rumor, the source of the Duke's premonition. I had saved the Duke, perhaps, for a brief moment, but in doing so I had ignited a spark of suspicion in the King's mind. I moved away from the confessional, sweat running down my forehead, despite the cold. The plan had worked, but the consequences were terrifying. I had become a player in the King's game, an invisible pawn, but now a pawn who had made too bold a move. The Duke of Valois was safe for now, but the King was on high alert. He would not give up, and now he was searching for me, perhaps even without knowing who or what he was looking for. I had bought time, but at what cost? The tension in the chapel was palpable, the air heavy with the invisible threat I had invoked. My simple life had been shattered. I was a banished man, a widower, a guardian of secrets, and now I was a target. The world would never be the same, and Master Barnaby, the widower, the banished, the guardian of a royal secret, knew he had to act again. Not for glory, not for power, but for the promise made to my wife, and for the lives of my grandsons. I needed to find a way to protect myself and them from a king who was now furious and suspicious. Time was running out, and with every beat of my heart, I felt the danger approach. Sweat ran down my forehead, cold, despite the stuffy air of the chapel. The echo of the King's words, full of fury and distrust, still resonated in my ears, not from the wood, but from within my own mind. I had saved the Duke, yes, but at what cost? I had become a ghost, a whisper, and now an invisible target for a monarch's wrath. The confessional, once a channel for terrible revelations, now seemed like a megaphone pointed directly at me, exposing each of my fears. My hands trembled as I moved away, my body heavy as lead. The chapel, which once offered a refuge of peace and oblivion, now seemed like a stage, and I, a reluctant actor in a high-stakes play. I looked at the small cloth bags where Finn and Liam slept, oblivious to the earthquake I had caused. Their innocent faces were a mirror of my promise, the reason why I had dared to defy fate. But what if my audacity condemned them? What if the King, in his blind search for the rumor's source, ended up finding me, and with that found my grandsons? The image of their simple lives being crushed by the royal machine was a poison that burned my insides. I could not stay. The chapel, isolated and abandoned, was an obvious place for a banished man to hide. And now, with the King searching for an enigmatic whisper, any isolated place became a question mark. But where to go? I was a homeless man, without resources, banished from society. My only wealth was the secret I carried and the promise that propelled me. Night approached again, bringing with it not the comfort of rest, but the darkness of my thoughts. I needed more information. I needed to know how close the King was to unraveling the mystery, to closing the net. It was a dangerous gamble, but ignorance was an even greater risk. With my breath caught in my throat, I returned to the confessional, the smell of ancient wood and dust seeming more oppressive than ever. I pressed my ear, feeling the cold wood against my skin. The initial silence was broken by distant voices, amplified as always. It was the king's advisor, his voice deep and worried. "Your Majesty, scouts have been sent. We are interrogating travelers who passed through the roads near the capital in the last 2 days. There are reports of an old man, a widower, who was seen wandering near abandoned chapels. A vague description, but..." My blood ran cold. An old man, a widower, abandoned chapels. The description was vague, yes, but it was disturbingly close. They were looking for me. Not by name, but by profile, by the shadow I had cast. I was no longer a ghost. I was beginning to take shape in their investigations. The king's voice erupted, more controlled now, but with a cold intensity that was even more terrifying. "Vague is not enough. Find him. If he is the messenger, he knows more. If he is just a fool, he will still serve as an example. And if he is the Duke of Valois in disguise, he will pay with his life." A duke in disguise? The king's mind was working on complex scenarios, trying to connect the dots in a way that benefited him. This gave me a small margin, perhaps. He was not looking for a simple widower with grandsons, but for something grander, more conspiratorial. But the description still haunted me. "And the rumors, Majesty?" asked the advisor. "The people speak of a whisper of the wind, a warning from the gods. This is starting to cause unrest." The king scoffed. "Superstitions. But if these superstitions are undermining my authority, they must be crushed. Increase the guard on the roads. Anyone who speaks of whispers or gods will be questioned, and send men to search the abandoned chapels in the vicinity. Start with those closest to the capital." The last sentence was a punch to the gut. The chapels closest to the capital. This was one of them. Time had run out. I no longer had 2 days, perhaps not even one. They would come, and when they came, they would find an old widower and 2 boys. I moved away from the confessional, stumbling. The wood's magic, which once seemed like a blessing, was now a curse, a clock ticking down the seconds to my own capture. I had rolled the dice, and although the Duke was safe for a time, I had put myself in the king's crosshairs. My mind raced, desperate. I needed a plan, and fast. Leaving the chapel was the first step, but where to? The city was dangerous, full of the king's eyes and ears. The forests were vast, but I had no supplies, and my grandsons were too young for a long and arduous escape. I looked at Finn and Liam, sleeping peacefully. I could not risk their lives. The promise to my wife echoed in my heart. "Protect them, Barnaby." I had failed to protect her, but I would not fail them. An idea born of desperation and necessity began to form, writhing like a snake in my chest. It was insane, dangerous, but perhaps it was the only chance. If the king was looking for an invisible messenger, perhaps I could use that invisibility to my advantage. If he was looking for an old widower, I needed to stop being one. But how? And most importantly, how could I continue to protect the Duke, and perhaps even the kingdom, if I was fleeing? The answer came with a chill, a dark recognition of the path I would have to take. I could not simply flee, I had to fight somehow, and to fight a king, I would need allies. Allies I did not have in a world that had rejected me. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple through the dusty windows. It was a spectacle of beauty that contrasted cruelly with the terror settling in my heart. I was Master Barnaby, the widower, the banished, the guardian of a royal secret, and now a fugitive. And the game, which I barely understood, was just beginning. I needed a plan, not just to survive, but to turn the tables on the king. And for that, I would need more than just whispers in the dark. I would need a voice that could be heard even by those who did not want to listen. The sun set, but there was no beauty in its farewell. The orange and purple light filtering through the dusty chapel windows was a cruel reminder of the dwindling time, a silent clock ticking down the seconds to my own capture. The king's words still echoed, no longer from the magical wood, but from within my own head. Send men to search the abandoned chapels in the vicinity. Start with those closest to the capital. This was one of them. There was no time for despair. There was only time to act. My eyes darted to Finn and Liam, still sleeping in the cloth bags, their breaths light and innocent. They were my promise, my curse, and my only reason. I could not fail them. With trembling but determined hands, I began to wake them. "Finn, Liam," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "We need to go now." Finn, the elder, opened his eyes immediately, sleepiness dissipating to give way to childish concern. "Grandpa, did something happen?" Liam, slower, just grumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Yes, my little wolf," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's time for a new adventure, but we need to be very, very quiet and quick." I helped them up, rolling up the cloth bags and the few provisions we had. There wasn't much to take, just the clothes on our backs and the overwhelming weight of my secret. The chapel, which once offered me refuge, now seemed like a trap. Every shadow, every creak of the old wood was an omen of the king's men's imminent arrival. I led them to the side door, the one I used to come and go unnoticed. The cold night air hit me, but it was a welcome cold, a gust of reality that propelled me forward. "Hold my hands very tight," I instructed, my voice an urgent whisper. "Don't look back. Just follow Grandpa." We stepped out into the growing darkness, the twisted bushes and trees of the forest swallowing us. I knew these paths. Years of banishment had taught me the art of moving unseen, of becoming a shadow among shadows. But now I was not alone. I had two small lives depending on me, two small hands that squeezed mine with a trust that broke my heart. My mind raced, desperate for a destination. The city was a viper's nest, the king's eyes and ears everywhere. The forests were vast, but without supplies and with small children, it was a slow death sentence. I needed a place that was safe, but that also allowed me to think, to plan. Then, a memory, like a lightning bolt on a dark night, struck me. A forgotten place, an old smuggler's route I had discovered in my solitary wanderings. A series of caves and underground passages that led to an old hunting cabin, long abandoned, deep in the forest, miles from here. It was an arduous journey, but it offered the promise of a temporary hiding place, away from the roads and the chapels, closest to the capital. "We're going north," I murmured to myself, more than to the children, to the grey hills. The boys, tired and confused, stumbled, but did not complain. Their resilience was a mirror of my own determination. I carried them when their small steps faltered, feeling the weight of their lives in my arms, the weight of my promise in my heart. As we moved through the darkness, the idea of a voice and allies did not leave me. I could not just run forever. I needed to fight. But how? Who could help me? My mind returned to my days before banishment, when I was Master Barnaby, the scholar, the advisor, not the widower. There was a woman, an old colleague, an eccentric historian named Ilara. She was a woman of sharp mind and even sharper tongue, with a network of contacts that spanned all layers of society, from the humblest to the most influential. She always had a healthy disdain for hypocrisy and tyranny, and a passion for truth. She was also a master at unearthing secrets. If anyone could help me find a voice, expose the king, gather allies, it would be Ilara. But she was in Aldoria, the capital, the heart of danger. And I, a banished man, a fugitive, how could I reach her? How could I convince her to risk everything for a widower the king was hunting? The idea was insane, dangerous, but the alternative was death or imprisonment, and with it, the condemnation of Finn and Liam. I needed information. I needed a plan that went beyond mere survival. I needed a plan to turn the tables. With each step in the forest, with each branch that broke under my feet, I felt the king's net tighten. I was a ghost, but a ghost with a trail. The hunting cabin in the Grey Hills was just a breather, a place to lick my wounds and forge the next step. I looked at the sky, now covered by a blanket of indifferent stars. The world was a cruel place, but I was not alone. I had Finn and Liam and the promise to my wife. And now I had a name, Ilara, a glimpse of hope amidst the darkness. I didn't know how, but I would find her. And together perhaps we could give a voice to the whispers and turn the rumors into a truth that the king could not crush. The game was just beginning, and I, Master Barnaby, the widower, the banished, the guardian of a royal secret, was ready to play. The darkness of the forest swallowed us. Each step was a silent prayer, each branch that broke under my feet, a cry I feared would echo too far. Finn and Liam, small and fragile, held my hands with a strength they didn't know they possessed, their eyes wide with the forced adventure, but still trusting in Grandpa. I carried them when their small bodies succumbed to exhaustion, feeling the weight of their lives in my arms, a burden heavier than any royal secret. The night air was biting, and the cold seeped into our thin clothes, but we couldn't stop. With each passing minute, the king's men approached, their lanterns perhaps already scouring the abandoned chapels, their voices perhaps already echoing where we had been just hours before. I moved like a ghost, guided by ancient memories of hunters' roots and forgotten trails. Years of banishment had transformed me into a shadow, a master in the art of disappearing. But disappearing with 2 children was a different challenge. I kept them close, whispering words of encouragement, inventing stories of brave explorers and hidden treasures to distract their minds from fear and cold. Their muffled laughs were the only melody in our silent escape, a bittersweet reminder of what I was fighting to protect. Hours turned into an eternity. The full moon, when it finally emerged from between the treetops, cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to move, each a potential pursuer. My muscles burned, my throat was dry, but adrenaline and terror propelled me. I could not fail. I could not lie. When the first pale glimpse of dawn began to tint the horizon, we reached the Grey Hills. They were not imposing hills, but a series of rocky and densely wooded elevations dotted with hidden cave entrances. I knew one of them, a secret passage that led to an underground labyrinth and finally to the old hunting cabin. It was a smuggler's refuge, forgotten by time and most men. "We're almost there, my little wolves," I whispered, my voice hoarse with exhaustion. Finn, though exhausted, nodded, his eyes fixed on me. Liam was almost asleep in my arms, his face pale and dirty. I found the entrance, camouflaged by dense vegetation and an overhanging rock. I pushed the foliage aside, revealing a dark, damp opening. The smell of wet earth and mold hit me, but it was a smell of safety. "Get in, quick!" The boys crawled inside and I followed, closing the entrance behind us with the utmost care. The darkness was almost total, but I knew the way. I lit a small oil lantern I had taken from the chapel, its flickering light barely illuminating the damp cave walls. The air was cold and stagnant, but we were hidden. The underground walk was shorter, but equally frightening for the children. I guided them through narrow passages and larger chambers until finally a faint light appeared ahead. It was the exit to the cabin. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it, small, dilapidated, almost swallowed by the forest. The roof was partially collapsed, the windows broken, and the door hung on one hinge. but it was a roof over our heads, and its walls, though fragile, offered us a disguise. We went inside. The interior was dusty and full of cobwebs, but there was an old wood stove and a pile of dry firewood I had left there years ago, just in case. I lit a small fire, more to warm the place and ward off the dampness than to cook. The warmth was a balm for our frozen bodies. As the boys huddled near the fire, finally allowing themselves to fall into a deep, well-deserved sleep, I sat, watching the flames dance. The relief was immense, but fleeting. We were safe for now, but for how long? This cabin was a hiding place, not a solution. My mind returned to Ilara, Aldoria, the capital, the lion's den. The idea of going there, a banished and wanted man, was suicide. But how could I fight a king without a voice, without allies? Ilara was the only person I knew with the intelligence, courage, and network of contacts to turn the whispers of the wind into a cry the kingdom could hear. She was not a woman of weapons, but of words. A master at unearthing inconvenient truths, at weaving narratives that could bring down empires. If anyone could expose the king, it would be her, but how would I find her? How would I convince her to risk her life for an old widower and a story that seemed like madness? I could not take Finn and Liam to Aldoria. The city was too dangerous, full of the king's eyes and ears. Leaving them alone in the cabin, even for a few days, was unthinkable. I could not abandon them. My promise to my wife echoed in my heart stronger than ever. I needed an intermediary, someone who could go to Aldoria in my place, someone Ilara knew and trusted. But who? My life before banishment had been one of academic isolation, not broad social ties. My few friends had abandoned me when the king turned his back on me. There was one name, a single name that came to mind, a man I had helped in his studies years ago, a young apothecary's apprentice, Elias. He was an idealist, a dreamer, but also a man of principles. He had moved to a small fishing village on the coast, far from the capital, to practice his art. He had nothing to do with the court, nor with the dangers I faced. But he owed me a favor, and he was discreet. Elias's village was several days' walk from here, in a different direction from Aldoria. I could go there, leave the boys with him, and then try to find a way to contact Ilara. It was a risky plan, full of uncertainties, but it was the only plan I had. I looked at Finn and Liam, sleeping peacefully, their breaths soft in the cold cabin air. They were my strength, my weakness. I would do anything for them. The morning sun began to filter through the cabin's cracks, painting the dust in the air with a golden glow. It was a new day, and with it the need for a new step. I was no longer just a fugitive. I was a messenger, a conspirator, and now a father on a desperate mission. The game was just beginning, and I was about to make my most dangerous move. I needed Elias, and Elias would lead me to Ilara, and Ilara, perhaps, would give me the voice I needed to bring down a king. The smell of salt and dried fish from Portobello soon faded, replaced by the damp aroma of the forest and wet earth. I moved with a new urgency, a dark freedom. The physical burden of carrying the boys had vanished, but the weight in my heart was immense. Each step away from them was a stab, but also an impetus. I was no longer just fleeing. I was hunting for truth, hunting for justice. Aldoria was a treacherous journey, not only because of the distance, but because of the omnipresent eyes and ears of the king. I knew the secondary routes, the forgotten paths that wound through the hills and valleys, avoiding the patrolled main roads. My mind, once divided between the immediate protection of the boys and the larger mission, was now entirely focused. I was a spectre, moving through the shadows, my senses sharpened for the slightest sign of danger. Every whisper of the wind seemed to carry a threat, every broken branch a pursuer. Hunger and fatigue were constant companions, but I ignored them. The image of Finn and Liam's faces, the promise I made to them and to my wife, were the fuel that propelled me. I could not fail, not now. With each mile covered, with each obstacle overcome, the conviction that I was the only hope solidified. I was a banished man, but also a herald of a terrible truth that needed to be shouted. As I delved deeper into the journey, Elias, in Portobello, faced his own ordeal. He waited until nightfall, until the village was asleep before preparing to leave. Fear was a knot in his stomach. He was not an adventurer, a spy, or a conspirator. He was an apothecary, a man of herbs and cures, not of secrets and betrayals. But the image of little Finn and Liam, sleeping peacefully in his house, and the memory of Master Barnaby's desperate gaze were stronger than his dread. He donned his most discreet cloak, hid the coin purse and the coded message close to his heart, and stepped out into the night. Elias's journey to Aldoria was different from mine. He did not have the experience of a hunted man, nor the desperate urgency of a grandfather. He traveled with the caution of an ordinary man who suddenly found himself dragged into a world of intrigue and danger. He avoided the main roads, but not with the same skill as I. His eyes were always searching for patrols, his heart pounding with every moving shadow. He knew the risk he was taking, but the goodness in his heart and his loyalty to me, his old mentor, impelled him forward. In Aldoria, the kingdom's beating heart, Ilara was in her study, surrounded by piles of scrolls and books. She was a woman of sharp intellect and discreet beauty, whose penetrating eyes missed no detail. She was a royal advisor, but her loyalty was to truth, not power. She saw corruption spreading like a disease, felt the pulse of unrest among the people, and her own whispers of discontent were carefully veiled in words of wisdom and counsel. She was a weaver of influences, a silent strategist, and the only person in Aldoria with the courage and intelligence to defy the king. She was reading an ancient treatise on the ethics of governance, a book few would dare touch openly, when one of her servants announced the arrival of an apothecary from Portobello, who insisted on speaking with her. Ilara raised an eyebrow. Portobello was a forgotten village. An apothecary from there would have no reason to seek her out unless... She received him in a discreet reception room. Elias, pale and visibly exhausted, bowed deeply. "Lady Ilara," he said, his voice a little hoarse, "I bring an urgent message." Ilara observed him closely, noticing the cold sweat on his forehead and the way his eyes swept the room. "From whom, apothecary?" "From an old friend," Elias replied, lowering his voice. "He asked me to say that Master Barnaby needs your help to give a voice to the whispers." The name Master Barnaby made Ilara's eyes widen almost imperceptibly. She leaned forward, her posture now tense. "Master Barnaby? He is alive?" "Yes, Lady Ilara," Elias whispered, "and he instructed me to mention a book, the Book of Silent Shadows." The mention of the book's title, a secret code only she and Barnaby shared, confirmed the message's authenticity. Ilara felt a shiver run down her spine. Barnaby, the man she respected above all else, the man the king had banished and tried to silence, was alive, and he was looking for her. "Continue," she said, her voice a thread. "He said the king is about to shed innocent blood," Elias continued, the urgency in his words growing, "and that he has the proof." Ilara leaned back in her chair, her mind working furiously. Barnaby was not a man of exaggeration. If he was saying the king planned a mass assassination and had proof, the situation was more serious than anyone could imagine. She remembered the whispers in the corridors, the king's increasingly erratic decisions, the growing paranoia. It all fit. "Apothecary," she said, her voice now firm and controlled. "You are in great danger, and so am I, for even hearing this. Where is Master Barnaby?" "He did not tell me his exact whereabouts, Lady Ilara," Elias admitted. He merely instructed me to find you and deliver the message. He said he would be nearby. Ilara nodded slowly. Barnaby was clever. He would not risk an ambush. He would be watching, waiting for a sign. Very well, she said, standing up. You have done well, Elias. You will be sheltered here safely. No one will know of your presence. But this information, it is a double-edged sword. If true, it could bring down the kingdom. If false, it could bring us down. Master Barnaby would never lie about something like this. Elias insisted, his loyalty unwavering. I know, Ilara replied, a subtle, dark smile on her lips. And that is why I believe him. Now, I need time to think, to plan. Tell me everything Barnaby told you. Every detail, no matter how small. As Elias began to recount the events in Portobello and the terrible truth Barnaby had discovered, I was approaching Aldoria. The castle towers, once a symbol of power and order, now seemed prey to an impending darkness. The city stretched out below them, a labyrinth of streets and houses, each harboring innocent lives the king intended to sacrifice. I hid on a hill overlooking the capital, watching the twinkling lights of the city come on as night fell. The air was cold, but the determination in my chest burned like a brazier. Elias had done his part. Now the ball was in Ilara's court. I trusted her. She was the brightest mind and the fairest heart I knew in Aldoria. The night in Aldoria was a heavy cloak, but for Ilara it was a blank canvas where the threads of the kingdom's destiny would be woven. Elias, the frightened apothecary, finished his account, each word echoing the urgency and danger that Master Barnaby had uncovered. Ilara listened with cold intensity, her eyes fixed, but her mind already flying, tracing scenarios, assessing risks, seeking the crack in the king's armor. So, he did not specify the king's exact target, only that it would be innocent blood? Ilara asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. As if she feared the walls had ears, Elias shook his head. No, Lady Ilara, he only said that the plans were overheard in the confessional of the Portobello chapel. Something about the wood, the magical wood. Ilara frowned. Magical wood. She had heard legends about certain ancient trees capable of retaining and transmitting echoes of past events, but never thought one would be in Portobello, much less that it would be the key to unmasking the king. It was such fantastic proof that it would be almost impossible to present. No one would believe it. And the Book of Silent Shadows? She continued. Does he have it? He did not bring it with him, Lady Ilara, Elias replied, but he said it is the proof that he would use it to give voice to the whispers. Ilara pondered. Barnaby was a man of science and logic, but also of deep faith. If he trusted a legend, there was a reason. The proof was not the book itself, but what it represented, the knowledge Barnaby had acquired, the ability to decipher the king's plans. The book was the code, not the message. Very well, Elias, she said, standing up and walking to the window, observing the city lights. You are safe here. No one must know you sought me out. Rest. Tomorrow we will have much to discuss, but for now, silence is our greatest ally. Elias, relieved, bowed again and was led to a discreet room. Ilara remained at the window, her mind in a whirlwind. The news of Barnaby's survival was already a shock. The revelation of his plans was an earthquake. The king, her own advisor, was becoming a tyrant. The signs had been there for months, the growing paranoia, the increasingly harsh decrees, the purge of loyal officials, and the rise of shadowy, ambitious figures. But a mass assassination, that was an abyss. She needed more than Barnaby's word, however much she trusted him. She needed an infallible strategy. The king was powerful, surrounded by loyal guards and spies. One false step, and not only she, but Barnaby, Elias, and perhaps even Barnaby's grandsons would be silenced forever. The first thing was to establish contact with Barnaby. He would be watching, waiting. But how? A messenger would be risky. A coded message could be intercepted. She needed a sign, something only Barnaby would understand, that confirmed she had received the message and was ready to act. Her eyes swept the city. The castle, imposing and dark, dominated the landscape. She knew its secrets, its passages. But Barnaby could not enter there undetected. He needed a way to communicate from outside, from a safe point. Suddenly, an idea came to her mind, as audacious as it was dangerous. The old lighthouse in Aldoria's harbour. It was rarely used, a relic of past times, but still functional. If she could light it in a specific way, a pattern only Barnaby would recognize as a signal that she was ready for the next step. Meanwhile, in the hills embracing Aldoria, I watched. The night's cold bit my skin, but I barely felt it. My eyes, accustomed to the darkness, swept the streets, the patrols, the shadows. The city slept, but I knew that beneath its surface, the king's web of intrigues was in full swing. I felt the weight of waiting, the agony of not knowing if Elias had arrived, if Ilara had understood. With each passing hour, the tension increased. I imagined Ilara in her study, reading the message, her brilliant mind working. She was the only one who could turn what I had heard into something tangible, something the kingdom could see and believe. My mind revisited the whispers of the confessional, the king's cold and calculating words, the indifference with which he planned the death of hundreds. The image of my grandsons, the promise of a safe future for them, was a fire that kept me warm against despair. I could not fail. Suddenly, a gleam, not from the castle nor from the houses, it was from the harbour. The ancient lighthouse, dormant for years, flashed once, then twice. A pause, and then 3 times. An irregular pattern, almost imperceptible to a casual observer, but to me it was a code. The code Ilara and I had created years ago for an emergency we never thought would come. My heart leaped. She had understood. She was ready. An immense relief flooded me, mixed with a new wave of adrenaline. The game was truly beginning. I was no longer alone. Ilara was the missing piece, the strategic mind that could take the whispers from the confessional and turn them into a cry that would bring down a king. But the joy was short-lived. Ilara's signal was a confirmation, but also a declaration of war. The king was not a man who forgave treason, and now Ilara was as much in danger as I. I needed to reach her, but how? Aldoria was a fortress, and I, a banished man, hunted. Entering the city would be suicide, but staying in the hills, waiting, was also not an option. Time was crucial. The king would not wait. I watched the lighthouse again. It flashed one last time, a single long gleam like a period. The message was clear. I am with you. Now, the next step. I stood up, my muscles aching from the cold and the vigil. It was time to move. I could not enter the city through the main gates, but I knew Aldoria. I knew its sewers, its forgotten tunnels, the secret passages few dared to use. There was an old aqueduct that led to the oldest parts of the city, a path I had explored in my youth, before becoming a family man, before being a widower, a grandfather, a herald of truth. The lighthouse flashed one last time, a sign of hope and danger. I was a banished man, yes, a widower and a grandfather who had left his grandsons behind. But now, I was not alone. Ilara was with me, and together we would turn the whispers of the confessional into a cry that would bring down a king. The Knight of Aldoria held the first moves of a silent war, and I, the herald of truth, was about to enter the heart of darkness. I began my descent. The descent through the hills was a prelude to the darkness that awaited me. Each step was calculated, each shadow a potential hiding place. Aldoria's cold night air penetrated my bones, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins was a more potent warmth. The lighthouse had flashed. Ilara had responded. I was no longer alone, but the truth was that the danger now multiplied. She was at risk, and I needed to reach her, not just to deliver myself to her, but to protect her. The ancient aqueduct, a stone skeleton forgotten by most, was my only entrance. In my youth, I had explored it with a boy's insatiable curiosity, mapping every curve, every crack. Now, that distant memory was my salvation. The entrance was camouflaged by dense vegetation, a natural veil hiding the dark, damp mouth of the tunnel. The smell of wet earth and mold filled my nostrils as I squeezed through the narrow opening. Inside, the darkness was absolute, a heavy cloak that seemed to swallow any light. I lit a small lantern, the flame flickering, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. The water, cold and shallow, ran beneath my feet, its murmur echoing in the oppressive silence. Every step was an act of faith, for the ground was uneven, covered in debris and slippery slime. I felt the weight of the secret I carried, the urgency of the mission, the lives of my grandsons, the hope of an entire kingdom. The aqueduct snaked beneath the city, a stone labyrinth that led me deeper and deeper into the heart of Aldoria. I knew I was getting closer when the distant sound of city life began to filter in. A dog's bark, a cart's creak, the muffled laughter of someone who had no idea of the shadow hanging over their lives. The tension was palpable, every nerve in my body on high alert. I was a ghost, moving through the forgotten veins of a city I once called home. As I crept through the darkness, Ilara in her study was no less busy. The lighthouse signal had been a relief, but also a catalyst for a new wave of anxiety. She knew I was on my way, but the question was where and how we would meet. The castle was more secure than ever. The king's patrols intensified. The monarch's paranoia was an enemy as dangerous as his assassination plans. She pored over a detailed map of Aldoria, tracing routes, evaluating meeting points. The Book of Silent Shadows and the story of the magical wood were the key, but also the biggest obstacle: how to convince the councillors, the people, of such a fantastic truth. The proof needed to be irrefutable, something that could not be dismissed as madness or treason. Barnaby, the apothecary, was a respected man, but his word alone against the king's would be insufficient. Ilara knew the king would not act without a motive, however twisted. He needed a pretext for his innocent blood. A forged rebellion? A simulated enemy attack? The possibilities were endless and all terrifying. She needed more information, details Barnaby had discovered, but which Elias could not transmit. Her sharp mind worked at high speed. Communication with Barnaby needed to be discreet and secure. She could not risk a direct meeting in her home. There was an old warehouse in the harbour district, rarely used, with a secondary entrance to a dark alley. It was a place she and Barnaby had used in their academic investigations years ago, a secret meeting point should politics become too dangerous. It was a risk, but a calculated risk. She needed a second signal, something that confirmed the location and time. The lighthouse was too obvious for continuous communication. Ilara thought of the old clock tower in the city centre. Its bell, long silenced, could be activated in a specific way, a pattern of chimes that only Barnaby and she would recognize. It would be a sound that would blend into the night's noises, but for them, it would be a clear message. While Ilara planned, the king, in his castle chambers, was immersed in his own schemes. His closest advisors, shadowy and ambitious figures, surrounded him, feeding his paranoia and validating his cruel decisions. He spoke of purifying the kingdom, of necessary sacrifices to maintain order. Each day his mind sank deeper into tyranny, and the date of his plan approached. The city to him was a chessboard, and its inhabitants mere pawns to be sacrificed. I, on the other hand, was emerging from the aqueduct's darkness. The fresh night air hit me like a shock, and I found myself in a narrow, damp, forgotten alley on the outskirts of the harbour district. The smell of salt and fish replaced the mold. I was inside Aldoria. The city lights twinkled before me, but now they seemed less inviting and more like watchful eyes. I moved through the shadows, an invisible man, but with a mission visible only to me. The lighthouse did not flash again, but the silence was a message in itself. Ilara was working. I knew the next step was hers. I had arrived. Now I needed to wait for her signal, for her guidance. The weight of the secret was still with me, but the loneliness had diminished. Ilara was the mind. I was the herald. Together, we would turn the whispers of the confessional into a cry that would bring down a king. The night of Aldoria held the next moves of a silent war, and I, the widower, the grandfather, the banished man, was ready to fight. I hid in the shadows of an abandoned warehouse, my eyes scanning the clock tower, waiting. I was no longer just waiting, I was watching, protecting, preparing for the moment when the truth, whispered in the confessional, would transform into a cry that would bring down a king. The game had truly begun, and I was in the heart of darkness, on the verge of light. The smell of rotten wood and sea salt was not just a reminder of my hiding place, it was a familiar melody. Wood, always wood. I remembered the confessional, its ancient fibers vibrating with secrets. And here, in this forgotten warehouse, the old wooden walls seemed to whisper. It wasn't the same magical wood, perhaps, but there was a resonance, a peculiar acoustics that allowed me to hear more than expected. The muffled sound of Barnaby and Ilara's conversation began to filter through the thin planks, a murmur that, to my trained ears, was surprisingly clear. Ilara entered the warehouse, her slender figure barely visible in the shadows. She wasted no time with greetings, her voice low and urgent. "Barnaby, what have you discovered?" "The lighthouse signal." Elias couldn't give me details. Barnaby's voice, usually calm and thoughtful, was tinged with contained dread. "Ilara, it's worse than we imagined. The king, he plans a simulated attack. Not against an external enemy, but against ourselves. The granaries of the East District, the merchants' houses, even the market square. He will set them on fire, blame a supposed rebellion, and use that as a pretext to cleanse the city. The names are already on a list. Community leaders, scholars, anyone who dares question his authority. A cold shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't just assassination, it was genocide, a bloody purification in the name of order. The king was insane. "When?" Ilara asked, her voice a steel thread. "Tomorrow night, at the height of the harvest celebration. The confusion will be perfect for his purposes. He plans to use city guards, disguised, to initiate the chaos. And then the rebels will be hunted down and publicly executed." Barnaby coughed, a dry, nervous sound. "I saw the plans, Ilara. There's a map with the targets marked in red, and the list of names. It's extensive." "Where are these documents?" Ilara demanded. "I copied them. They're here." I heard the rustle of papers. "But how will we prove this? The word of an apothecary and a scholar against the kings. He'll execute us for treason before we can open our mouths." Ilara paused, and I could feel her mind working, the gears of her intelligence turning at high speed. "The magical wood, Barnaby. The book of silent shadows. It's the only way. The confessional. The king uses it. If we can make him confess his plans again and have witnesses. Witnesses who would believe such a fantastic story, wood that amplifies thoughts. They'd commit us to an asylum." Barnaby was skeptical, but the desperation in his voice was palpable. "Not thoughts, Barnaby. Words. The confessional amplifies words, secrets. Elias heard the king, I heard Elias. What if we can bring the counselors, the guild leaders, the archbishop to the chapel? Not to the confessional, but to the nave. They don't need to know about the magical wood beforehand. We just need them to be there to hear. The idea was audacious, dangerous, but brilliant. It was irrefutable proof. The king's own voice reverberating through the chapel, undeniable. But how? Barnaby asked, his voice a whisper. How will we make the king confess his plans again? And how will we gather these people without raising suspicion? The king is a man of habit. He goes to the chapel before great events to purify his soul. Tomorrow night, before the massacre, he will be there. We need a pretext to gather the others. An emergency meeting about the harvest celebration security, something that brings them to the chapel, but doesn't alert them to what they will actually hear. Ilara explained, her voice gaining strength. And Elias, he is the key. He is the herald. He needs to be there, hidden, to guide the people, to ensure they hear, and to be the living proof of what the wood can do. My heart pounded in my chest. Elias, me. My granddaughter was giving me a crucial role, the role I was born to play. I was the herald, the guardian of truth, and now I would be the guide. But what if the king doesn't go to the confessional? Barnaby argued. He will. Guilt, even for a tyrant, is a heavy burden. He will seek absolution, even if it's from a god he has twisted for his own ends. And if he doesn't, Elias will be there to ensure he enters. He knows the chapel's secret paths, the guards' blind spots. It was a risky plan, each step a dance with death, but it was the only plan. What if he discovers us first? Barnaby asked, fear still present. Then we die trying, but we will not die in silence. Truth will be our shield, and the king's voice our sword, Ilara replied, her voice now filled with a cold, unwavering determination. We must act now. Barnaby, you must use your contacts in the guilds among the merchants. Spread the word of an emergency meeting at the chapel an hour before midnight to discuss additional security measures for the harvest celebration. Use your prestige to ensure they attend. Say there are rumors of trouble and that the king is concerned. And you? Barnaby asked. I will prepare the chapel, and I will ensure the Book of Silent Shadows is in a safe but accessible place for when the truth is revealed. And Elias. Ilara paused, and I felt she was speaking to me, even without knowing I was there. Elias will be there. He is the living proof, the link between the whisper and the cry. He is justice. I moved in the shadows, my body tired, but my mind sharper than ever. I had heard everything. The plan was clear. Aldoria's knight held the next moves of a silent war, and I, the widower, the grandfather, the banished man, was ready to fight. I was no longer just a listener. I was an active participant, the catalyst that would transform the whispers of the confessional into a cry that would bring down a king. Tomorrow night, the harvest celebration. The king in his chapel, the witnesses gathered, and I, Elias, in the heart of darkness, on the verge of light, ready to ignite the flame of truth. The game had truly begun, and Aldoria's fate was in my hands and in the voice of a king who would condemn himself with his own words.